churned in a forward and upward dash. But the water worked to frustrate that charge, for one of the pit walls crumbled, overbalancing the creature so that the fore end of the shell lifted from the ground, the legs clawing wildly at the air. Shann thrust with the spear, feeling the knife point go home so deeply that he could not pull his improvised weapon free. A limb snapped claws only inches away from his leg as he pushed down on the haft with all his strength. That attack, along with the initial upset of balance, did the job. The shell flopped over, its rounded hump now embedded in the watery sand of the pit, while the frantic struggles of the creature to right itself only buried it the deeper. The Terran stared down upon a segmented underbody, where legs were paired in rib-like formation. Shann could locate no head, no good target, but he drew his stunner and beamed at either end of the oval, and then for good measure in the middle, hoping in one of those three general blasts to contact the thing's central nervous system. He was not to know which of those shots did the trick, but the frantic wiggling of the legs slowed and finally ended, as a clockwork toy might run down for want of winding, and at last projected at crooked angles completely still. The shell creature might not be dead, but it was tamed for now. Taggi had only been waiting for a good chance to do battle. He grabbed one of those legs, worried it, and then leaped to tear at the underbody. Unlike the outer shell, this portion of the creature had no proper armor, and the wolverine plunged joyfully into the business of the kill, his mate following suit. The process of butchery was a bloody, even beastly job, and Shann was shaken before it was complete. But he kept at his labors, determined to have that shell, his one chance of escape from the island. The wolverines feasted on the greenish-white flesh, but he could not bring himself to sample it, climbing to the heights in search of eggs and making a happy find of a niche filled with the edible moss fungi. By late afternoon he had the shell scooped fairly clean, and the wolverines had carried away for burial such portions as they had not been able to consume at their first eating. Meanwhile, the leather-headed birds had grown bold enough to snatch up the fragments he tossed out on the water, struggling for that bounty against feeders arising from the depths of the lagoon. At the coming of dusk, Shann hauled a blood-stained grizzly trophy well up the beach and wedged it among the rocks, determined not to lose his treasure. Then he stripped and washed, first his clothing and then himself, rubbing his hands and arms with sand until the skin was tender. He was still exuberant at his luck. The drift would supply him with materials for an outrigger, one more day's work, or maybe two, and he could leave. He wrung out his blouse and gazed towards the distant line of the shore. Once he had his new canoe ready, he would try to make the trip back in the early morning while the mists were still on the sea. That should give him cover against any Throg flight. That night Shann slept in the deep fog of bodily exhaustion. There were no dreams, nothing but an unconsciousness which even a Throg attack could not have pierced. He roused in the morning with an odd feeling of guilt. The water hole he had scooped in the valley yielded him some swallows tasting of earth, but he had almost forgotten the flavor of a purer liquid. Munching on a fistful of moss, he hurried down to the shore, half fearing to find the shell gone, his luck out once again. Not only was the shell where he had wedged it, but he had done better than he knew when he had left it exposed in the night. Small things scuttled away from it into hiding, and several birds arose. Scavengers had been busy lightening his unwelcome task for that morning. And seeing how the cleanup process had gone, Shann had a second inspiration. Pushing the thing down the beach, he sank it in the shallows with several rocks to anchor it. Within a few seconds, the shell was invaded by a whole school of spiny-tailed fish that ate greedily, leaving his find to their cleansing. Shann went back to prospect the pile of raft material, choosing pieces which could serve for an outrigger frame. He was handicapped, as he had been all along, by the absence of the vines one could use for lashings, and he had reached the point of considering a drastic sacrifice of his clothing to get the necessary strips when he saw Taggy dragging behind him one of the jointed legs the wolverines had put in storage the day before. Now and again Taggy laid his prize on the shingle, holding it firmly pinned with his forepaws as he tried to worry loose a section of flesh. But apparently that feat was beyond even his notable teeth, and at length he left it lying there in disgust while he returned to a catch of more palatable fare. Shann went to examine more closely the triple-jointed limb. The casing was not as hard as horn or shell, he discovered upon testing. It more resembled tough skin laid over bone. With a knife he tried to loosen the skin, a tedious job requiring a great deal of patience, since the tissue tore if pulled away too fast. But with care he acquired a few thongs, perhaps a foot long. Using two of these, he made a trial binding of one stick to another and experimented further, soaking the whole construction in seawater and then exposing it to the direct rays of the sun. When he examined his test piece an hour later, the skin thongs had set into place with such success that the one piece of wood might have been firmly glued to the other. Shann shuffled his feet in a little dance of triumph as he went on to the lagoon to inspect the waterlogged shell. The scavengers had done well. One scraping, two at the most, would have the whole thing clean and ready to use. But that night Shann dreamed. No climbing of a skull-shaped mountain this time. Instead, he was again on the beach, laboring under an overwhelming compulsion, building something for an alien purpose he could not understand. And he worked as hopelessly as a beaten slave, knowing that what he made was to his own undoing. Yet he could not halt the making, because just beyond the limit of his vision there stood a dominant will which held him in bondage. And he awoke on the beach in the very early dawn, not knowing how he had come there. His body was bathed in sweat, as it had been during his day's labor under the sun, and his muscles ached with fatigue. But when he saw what lay at his feet, he cringed. The framework of the outrigger close to completion the night before was dismantled, smashed. All those strips of hide he had so laboriously culled were cut into inch-long bits which could be of no service. Shann whirled, ran to the shell he had the night before pulled from the water and stowed in safety. Its rounded dome was dulled where it had been battered, but there was no break in the surface. He ran his hands anxiously over the curve to make sure. Then, very slowly, he came back to the mess of broken wood and snipped hide. And he was sure, only too sure of one thing. He himself had wrought that destruction. In his dream he had built to satisfy the whim of an enemy. In reality he had destroyed. And that was also, he believed, to satisfy an enemy. The dream was a part of it, but who or what could set a man dreaming and so take over his body, make him in fact betray himself? But then, what had made Thorvald maroon him here? For the first time, Shann guessed a new, if wild, explanation for the officer's desertion. Dreams, and the disk which had worked so strangely on Thorvald. Suppose everything the other had surmised was the truth. Then that disk had been found on this very island, and here somewhere must lie a clue to the riddle. Shann licked his lips. Suppose that Thorvald had been sent away under just such a strong a compulsion as the one which had ruled Shann last night. Why was he left behind if the other had been moved away to protect some secret? Was it that Shann himself was wanted here? wanted so much that when he at last